G'day, welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today, I'm coming to you live from the ANZAC Memorial in Hyde Park in Sydney. And I'm here today to talk to military historian and director of the memorial, Brad Manera. And he has joined us today to talk about Australia's involvement in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Hi Brad, thanks for joining us on the show.
G'day Adam, nice to see you.
No, thank you, Brad. It's a privilege and an honour to have you on. And so basically today what I wanted to do, Brad, was get you on to talk about Australia's involvement in the Korean War. And for many Australians, their main source of knowledge about the Korean War is the popular TV show MASH, which depicts the events from an American point of view. But can you just give us an overview of what Australia was doing in Korea, please, mate?
Oh, that's a huge question. Adam, I think really just trying to imagine what life was like in Australia in the years immediately after the Second World War presents us with an enormous challenge, because Australia in the 21st century is a very different place to the way our parents and grandparents remembered the 1950s and indeed the period that immediately following the Second World War. So with that in mind, let's imagine Australia having emerged from the Second World War. We're talking about a country of 7 million people that's suddenly had the enormous shock of an enemy on our doorstep, as it was in 1942 when the Japanese were attacking northern Australia by air and southern Australia by sea. And 997,000 Australians wore a uniform during the war of some description. So that means that the war reached into every home in Australia. And when the war ended in 1945, it really took until 46 to get our blokes home. But it gave Australians a greater awareness of our place in the world. And so suddenly Asia wasn't as remote as it had been, because it came to our doorstep, and then for the next few years we went into Asia to fight a war. So when the war breaks out in Korea, Australians are suddenly aware that we have a place on the international stage. And so Australians may not have known where Korea was, but we wanted to participate. We wanted to have a role in international politics because we had seen ourselves become a victim to it during the war, and we wanted to go on the front foot, if you like.
So for Australia, Brad, was there a war weariness, or were we very keen to help our UN friendship out?
I think there's both. Adam, I think it's an astute question, because we've got to suggest that Australia was a complex place. We were accepting huge numbers of refugees from Europe because we wanted to build our population. We had felt threatened. We had felt that Australia was a largely underpopulated landmass, and that expanding our population could help us defend the place. Yes, we were war weary. Yes, we were looking forward to peacetime development, peacetime expansion, but we also wanted to have a military stance. And so we sent representatives of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army, and eventually by 1948 we had created an Australian Army. We hadn't had one prior to that. We had the Australian Commonwealth Military Forces, later the Australian Military Forces, but in 1948 they came together and formed the Australian Army. The sharp end of the Australian Army was on deployment as part of our occupation force in Japan, as was our frontline fighter squadron, number 77 squadron. So, the sharpest part of Australia's Defence Force was in fact beyond our shores. They were on garrison duty, on occupation force in Japan. So when the Korean War broke out, Australia was on the doorstep. The other thing we've got to remember about Australia in the years after the Second World War was that we became involved in the new international policeman, the United Nations, and we were a very active part. We wanted Australian military personnel to actively participate as United Nations observers, and in fact, Ron Rankin and Stuart Peach, two Australian Army, well, one was an Army officer, the other was an Air Force officer, were part of UNCOC, the United Nations Commission on Korea, and their task was to inspect the division between North and South Korea, and they wrote the report that really allowed the United Nations into the Korean War. So, Australia played quite a surprising role in the Korean War. Indeed, I think we can say that it was Australians that are responsible for the fighting phase of the Korean War.
Can you share with us how Korea came to be divided and how North and South formed from the fighting of the war and how the hostilities started between them?
That's an important part of the story. The Korea, since the early 20th century, had been a Japanese colony, and the Japanese had ripped minerals out of the north and timber out of the south. They had used the Korean population as labourers and I guess as a stepping stone into Asia, into mainland Asia. And so at the end of the Second World War, with Japan defeated, Japan's territories are suddenly caught in a power vacuum. The Japanese had to relinquish control of the Korean peninsula, and the victorious forces of the Second World War are dividing up the map of the world into their own spheres of influence. And so the Korean peninsula tragically gets divided in half, and the northern half is under the control of the Soviet Union, the real victors of the war in Europe, the massive Red Army that marched all the way from the outskirts of Moscow to conquer Berlin. So they were a major player during the Second World War. So at the end of the war, the world was being divided between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, particularly the United States. And so the Korean Peninsula is a case study in that division. The northern section was handed over to control of the Soviet Union, and the southern half from the 37th parallel south was was sort of supervised by the United States. And so, of course, the Americans really were keen to demobilise and discharge their army, and so they wanted to establish a local government, hopefully a liberal democracy, in the southern part of Korea as quickly as possible. So what they left behind was this demarcation line along the parallel, this mountainous central rib dividing North and South Korea, where pro-Soviet North Korean troops and pro-UN or pro-US southern troops faced each other in this line of mountain outposts, and that line was being visited by representatives of the United Nations. And in the case of June 1950, those representatives were these two Australians, an Australian Air Force and an Australian Army officer, Ron Rankin and Stuart Peach. They had recently arrived in Korea, and their first task was to inspect the demarcation line, and they found that there had been a great deal of tension on the border. Clashes, armed clashes, shots had been exchanged by these two groups, the communists from the north and the South Koreans that were trying to create the Republic of Korea, the South Korean army. And so it was a very, very tense environment. The assessment by Rankin and Peach was that the South Korean army and this tiny US garrison that had been left behind had no offensive capability. They were essentially just guarding the portion of the Korean Peninsula that had been given over to the Western Allies. But the real power on the Korean Peninsula was the North Korean army that was being rebuilt along the lines of the Red Army. They had Soviet-made T-34 tanks, and they were training very aggressively. So it was the conclusion of Rankin and Peach that if there was going to be any aggression at all on the peninsula, it was going to come from the north. And that was the report they submitted. And so on dawn of the 25th of June 1950, when those North Korean T-34s rolled across the border and the army of North Korea, the North Korean People's Army, invaded the south, the US their representatives at the United Nations were able to wave Rankin and Peach's report under the noses of the Security Council in the United Nations and say this is an act of aggression by the North, and they want to unite the Korean Peninsula as a force of arms and take over the Korean Peninsula, the last sort of western outpost on the Asian mainland for the Soviet Union, for the communist bloc, and so the United Nations used that report to say yes, this is we agree that this is a clear act of aggression by the Communist North, and therefore the United Nations Security Council is able to come to the aid of the victim of that aggressor, and that is the Army of the Republic of South Korea, or the Army of the Republic of Korea, the South Korean Army. And so immediately UN member states marshalled their forces and began to deploy them in stages to the Korean Peninsula, and that's how Australia got involved, because we had Army, Navy and air units immediately across the straits in Japan, and so they were ready to deploy.
So for you as a historian, Brad, do you agree and that Australia should have got involved in the conflict, or did they have a little choice?
The Australian government at the time was very conscious that we were a player on a world stage. We were no longer simply a passive dominion of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth of Nations. We wanted to be seen as a nation in our own right, and so so as a result, I think that our government was very keen to demonstrate our enthusiasm for getting involved in international politics and becoming a responsible international citizen under the UN Charter.
So Robert Menzies, he was Prime Minister when the war broke out. How close, Brad, was his ties with the United States President Harry Truman and the British government, and how do you think they influenced his decision to commit Australia to the conflict?
That's an interesting question. I think that Menzies had a strong relationship with both. He was traditionally very British in his outlook, but he was also very aware that the Australian population felt that they owed a debt of gratitude to the United States for the assistance that the Americans had given us in defending ourselves during the Japanese conquest of the Pacific. And so he felt a strong allegiance to both. But I think he also wanted to demonstrate that Australia wanted to stand up for itself and be seen as a middle power in international politics. So yes, we were demonstrating our support for the United States by going to the Korean War, but we were also making a statement about Australia's involvement as an international citizen.
When we were committed to the conflict, Brad, whose command did we come under? Were we under the Americans or were we under the UN banner itself?
The entire Korean War from the Allied perspective, or the anti-Soviet, anti-communist perspective, if you like, was notionally the UNC, the United Nations Command. In reality, the United Nations Command was America. Everybody wore a United Nations pale blue patch on their uniforms. And there was always a United Nations white on blue flag flying at any peace negotiations, at any major military headquarters. But of course, Australia only sent 1 battalion of infantry, later 2 battalions of infantry to the war, 1 squadron of fighters, and later a transport squadron, and a fairly small fleet commitment, later our aircraft carrier, but the Australian commitment to the war was, in comparison to the United States and South Korea, a fairly minor commitment. So, of course, we're not going to really fight battles on our own. We've got to operate as part of the UN Command umbrella. And, of course, the British also send troops, and for reasons of supply and all of those sorts of things. I mean, the British are using .303 caliber weapons, as are we. So, we get brigaded with the British.
So from an Australian perspective, Brad, unlike the 2 world wars, this war, in some opinion, doesn't seem to have as much impact on the nation, and as it seems as if very little is known about battles that Australians were involved in. Could you share with us some of the pivotal battles where Australians served, and tell us what their significance was in the Korean War?
Sure. Look, yes, Korea doesn't have the high profile of the world wars of the 20th century, but then you've got to remember that Australia sent 330,000 people to the Great War, and 997,000 Australians wore a uniform during the Second World War. Only 17,000 Australians served in Korea. So, you can imagine that the public awareness and the search for a relative who's involved, or a friend who's involved, is going to be that much harder when it comes to Korea. It's the Korean War is having less of an impact because it's affecting fewer Australians. So for that reason, it plays a lesser role in Australia's cultural and historical memory than the world wars of the 20th century. Nevertheless, Australian sailors, soldiers and airmen earned an extraordinary reputation in that war for gallantry and skill and innovation. I suppose probably the best remembered action by Australian ground forces occurred on the eve of ANZAC Day 1951, when the North Koreans and the Chinese, particularly the Chinese, launched their 5th phase offensive in the last week of April 1951, and broke through the South Korean division that was operating north of the Australians. The Australians had been taken out of the line. They'd been in contact almost daily for the previous 2 months, and so they were taken out of the line for a rest and refit, and suddenly the Chinese broke through and were heading for Seoul, and they were about 60 kilometres north of Seoul when the Australians, the Canadians and a British battalion were thrown into the line around the junction of the Kapyong River. And the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, was deployed across, straddling the road to Seoul, and the road ran parallel to the branch of the river. Between the road and the river was a long ridgeline known as the Island Feature, and on the far side of the road was a mountain, Hill 504, 504 metres above sea level, and 2 spur lines running down from that mountain. Now the Australians deployed their battalion on the ridgeline and on the spurs and on the summit of Hill 504 a very dispersed battalion position. There should have been a brigade holding that location, and yet there were only about 600 Australian soldiers and close to 20,000 Chinese troops coming down the road to Seoul. The Australians had to hold while UN forces formed a stronger defensive line further south, and the Australians did a remarkable job. The 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, every company was essentially fighting its own battle, and the Canadians on their left, and they held the Chinese for a day and a half, did a remarkable job holding the Kapyong Valley. Eventually they were forced to fall back. Some command decisions that were poor exercise of judgment by the Australians and overwhelming numbers on the part of the Chinese forced 3 RAR to withdraw from that location. Nevertheless, they had held the Chinese, they had blunted that massive offensive, and so the Australians, the Canadians and the American tank platoon that was supporting them were awarded the US Distinguished Presidential Unit Citation, which is a little blue piece of ribbon that 3 RAR still wears with pride today. So the Battle of Kapyong is the day that Australian-Korean War veterans remember as their principal battle of the war, whereas a few months later, indeed in October of 1951, 3 RAR again distinguished itself with the capture of a feature called Hill 317 or Mariang San. 317 was the high point of a series of mountaintops running in 2 ridge lines at right angles to the Imjin River, and the war had become a stalemate by late 1951, and 3 RAR's task was to try and break the stalemate in that portion of the line. And they'd watched the British attack a feature in front of Hill 317, Little Gibraltar or Hill 355, on several occasions and be driven back on each occasion. And so by this stage, Frank Hassett, General Sir Francis Hassett later, had taken over command of 3 RAR, and he decided to attack in the mist along the Imjin River and outflank the Chinese positions. And again, 3 RAR did a remarkable job. Attacking in company strength units, they got behind a huge number of Chinese that were holding those ridge lines. Hill 355, the brigades of the British had assaulted and been driven back from. A single company from 3 RAR went up the back of that feature through the mist, almost fighting on a one-man front, and they drove the Chinese out at the with a single Aussie Bren gunner leading the way. An extraordinary feat of arms, and they captured Hill 355 while the rest of the battalion made its way along the riverbank through the mist and attacked pockets of Chinese one after another until they assaulted along the ridgeline that culminated in the capture of Hill 317. Then they found, when the mist lifted, that the Chinese still held their flank on a feature called the Hinge, and so the next day the survivors assaulted downhill across open ground and captured the Hinge as well, and they held that position for the next 4 days against repeated Chinese human wave assaults. It's just the attack, the capture and the defence of Mariang San is just a remarkable feat of arms. General Cassels, who was commanding the British Brigade at the time, when he became an instructor at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, referred to Mariang San as the finest battalion action in British military history, or at least one of. High praise indeed from a very fine British soldier. So again, Mariang San has become a battle honour for the Royal Australian Regiment and for 3 RAR. And I guess the final battle that has also recently become a battle honour is that in the Samichon River, fought on the last day of the war, where the Chinese and the UN forces knew that peace was coming. You know, the war had bogged down into nearly 2 years of stalemate trench warfare stretching along the parallel, almost on top of the line where the war had started. And on the 24th of July, Brigadier John Wilton was in charge of the Commonwealth Brigade holding a feature called the Hook. He had 3 RAR on the right, 2 RAR on the left, and further down the ridgeline to his left were the US Marines, and they were on the high ground above the Samichon River Valley. And he was told, tell your boys to keep their heads down, no more aggressive patrol actions, peace is only days away. And he passed that down to his battalion and possibly his company commanders, just to try and save a few lives. The Chinese did not have the same attitude to their soldiers, and before the armistice could come into effect, the Chinese launched human wave assaults across the Samichon Valley and up onto the Hook, preceded by massive artillery bombardments that fell largely on the American Marines. The Marines were forced to fall back, and which exposed 2 RAR's flank. The Chinese then fell on 2 RAR in a battle lasting more than 24 hours. 2nd Battalion held their location. I guess one of the great stories of 2 RAR's defence of the Hook was a machine gun bunker on Hill 111 held by a 19-year-old sergeant named Brian Cooper. Cooper and 8 of his blokes held this bunker that protected the flank of the battalion, and all through the night he ended up calling artillery down onto his own position 3 times. On the 3rd occasion, the gunner officer came back and said, "Hold on, son, you've pushed your luck." Brian Cooper held, and 7 or 8 of his mates held that bunker against continuous Chinese attacks through the night. Artillery was raining down, people overrunning him. He called in artillery onto his own position. They were fighting at that close quarters, and on the 3rd occasion, the gunner officer came back and said, "Hold on, son. You've pushed your luck as far as it can possibly reach. British tanks are on the way." And so by dawn, the British tanks had driven the Chinese back. When the sun came up, Brian and his mates counted over 300 Chinese bodies on the roof and in the vicinity of his bunker. He got an immediate award of the military medal. Tragically, one of the soldiers from 2 RAR died on the 27th of July, 1953, the day, almost the hour, in which the armistice came into effect. It's just one of those crazy battles, because both sides knew that when the armistice came into effect, both sides had agreed that the condition of the armistice was that they were to withdraw 2,000 metres. So all of those Chinese losses, and General Wilton estimated that there were over 3,000 Chinese bodies in front of 2 RAR, and they knew that within days they were going to have to walk back 2,000 metres, both sides, to create that 4-kilometre wide demilitarised zone. Now, that's just one of the great tragedies, I think, of the war, with a number of people killed and injured in those last 24 and 48 hours before the armistice came into effect on the 27th of July 1953. No peace treaty has ever been signed, so notionally the 2 Koreas are still at war, but at least the shooting has stopped. But both sides are still on a war footing, and Australia still plays a role. Australia still has a detachment that is part of the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission.
Those numbers, Brad, are just staggering, that still fighting right up till the armistice. It's just those numbers, like you said, and just to move 2,000 metres back, it's just, you can't, just like you say, it's part of war, and it's the true cost of what war is.
Heartbreaking and futile, but I think that the Australian soldier can draw a great deal of pride in the military skills of the battalions that deployed to Korea.
So who were the Australian commanders, Brad, and how effective were they whilst we were over in Korea?
The Australian commanders did an outstanding job. They were fairly junior, of course. Our first deployment to Korea, the first Australians in combat in Korea, was number 77 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, a Second World War, a fighter squadron issued with Second World War period Mustang P-51 fighters, propeller-driven aircraft, operating out of Iwakuni in Japan, and they were commanded by a Queenslander named Lou Spence, and very, very gallant aviators. They were in contact, escorting US bombers within 7 days of the North Koreans operating the North Korean invasion of South Korea, and their principal role was ground attack, trying to slow the North Korean advance and provide air support for the tiny and shattered elements of the South Korean army and the US forces, the US garrison that was left behind in Korea, and it was in one of those ground attack roles that Lou Spence was killed. So the commander of the RAAF on operations in Korea was killed within months of the outbreak of the war and the deployment of the RAAF. The Royal Australian Regiment was in the process of relocating to Australia from the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, and 2 of the 3 battalions had already come home, leaving 3 RAR behind. And in a very controversial decision, the battalion commander was replaced just weeks before the battalion deployed to Korea, and Charlie Green, who'd been the youngest battalion commander in the AIF in the Second World War, took command of the battalion, and they landed in Korea in late September, early October of 1950, joining the initial advance out of the Pusan perimeter, advancing north to the DMZ and eventually into North Korea. And Charlie Green knew that he had a force made up of Second World War veterans, recently recruited blokes that had never been in action before, recent volunteers that had come straight out of Civvy Street, and he needed to weld them into a team as well as fight a war. And he did an extraordinary job in those battles in late 1950, welding that battalion of 800 or 900 individuals into a very effective combat weapon that was able to, by April 1951, take on the Chinese army in the Battle of Kapyong. Tragically, Charlie Green was killed just after the Battle of Pakchon in November 1950, so he again did not get to see his battalion win its greatest battle honour. And so, there's this extraordinary loss of, within months of the outbreak of the war, we lose the commander of our air contingent, we lose the commander of our ground forces. The Navy had more luck, saw less combat. Nevertheless, because Australia was deploying small ships, apart from our aircraft carrier HMAS Sydney, Australian destroyers and frigates were in operations, in close inshore attacks on North Korean forces, and they distinguished themselves time and again in attacking North Korean and Chinese lines of communication with naval gunfire. Warwick Bracegirdle, commanding HMAS Bataan, earned his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross. He'd won his first during the Second World War. Dollard, commanding HMAS Murchison, took the ship up the Han River, this crazy tidal river, to almost within gunfire range of where the initial peace talks were going on. Must have scared the hell out of the North Koreans and Chinese. So yeah, we had some quite remarkable and very, very gallant combat leaders in that war, and tragically, 2 of them are buried in the United Nations Military Cemetery in Busan.
Amazing stories, Brad. And so what was the overall casualties and how many Australians were killed in the Korean War?
As I mentioned, about 17,000 Australian sailors, soldiers and airmen deployed to Korea from between June of 1950 and the end of July 1953. The largest component was the Royal Australian Regiment, and we rotated soldiers through the 3rd Battalion. So the 3rd Battalion went to Korea in late 1950 and stayed there right through to the armistice, and soldiers were rotated through the battalion after doing an 11 to 13 month tour of duty or sent home through wounds. The other battalions that joined them later, initially the 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, 1 RAR, and 1 RAR was there for a year, and then they were replaced by 2 RAR who fought the final battle of the war and then remained on as garrison troops to finish their 12-month tour. So the Korean War, Australian soldiers saw a lot of combat service. Fortunately, their casualty figures don't reflect just how much combat they saw, but what I think it also does is represent the level of professionalism of the members of the Royal Australian Regiment. 339 Australians were killed or died on active service during the Korean War. Most of them are buried in the United Nations Military Cemetery in Busan. Some are buried at Yokohama at the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Japan, and others who lived long enough to be repatriated to Australia are buried in local cemeteries around Australia. Several thousand were wounded. All of them will carry memories and scars for the rest of their lives, and an extraordinary generation of very fine soldiers. But you've got to remember, and I guess you started this discussion referring to MASH, during the Second World War, medical science expanded enormously, and our notion of how to treat battle casualties really advanced. Blood transfusions became much more reliable. Combat evacuation by air became commonplace, and so the survival rate of wounded soldiers was dramatically increased during the Korean War by comparison with the Second World War, and enormously different to that of the First World War. So, when you look at Korean War casualties, I don't necessarily think they reflect just how much combat our soldiers saw.
So little of the Korean War seems to have found its way into the nation's memory, Brad, and how do you think that could be changed for future generations, and how do you think this war should be commemorated to give it greater visibility?
Commemoration of any war is probably a reflection on public attitude as much as the significance, the military significance of that war. And the Korean War is an interesting study because, as you mentioned earlier, there was this notion of war weariness. People really didn't want to think about another war after having suffered the 6 years of the Second World War. And so the Korean War, of course, suffers by comparison. However, the American media referred right from the almost from the outbreak of the war as to the Korean conflict as a forgotten war, and the Australians have just picked it up. And really, it's fascinating when you hear people refer to Korea as the forgotten war now, 70 years after the event, and yet you have a look at the popular media of the day, and you can see that in fact the Korean War features in newspapers almost on a weekly basis. So at the time it wasn't forgotten, it was in the media. It may not have made the headlines, but if you wade through the newspapers, there is always an article about an Australian soldier, sailor or airman, or a political or military outcome of the war. The threat of communism at the start of the Cold War was very high, and so the Australian public were very interested in war fighting activity against communism. And so the Korean War features in our papers. It's very funny. History can be very fickle. And so 70 years after the war, we refer to it as the Forgotten War. The reality is, if you look at the popular media of the early 1950s, it was anything but. Indeed, there was a huge recruiting program in Australia called K-Force, and it was oversubscribed. We had more volunteers for K-Force than we could possibly deploy in to the Royal Australian Regiment fighting in Korea.
So, in your experiences, Brad, with you speaking to Korean veterans, as a historian, have you found that they often feel that they are overlooked or forgotten?
Short answer is yes. Many Korean War veterans feel that their war has been overlooked. But this is the case with veterans of small wars, and always has been. The veterans of the war in the Peninsula were quite vocal when the Waterloo Medal came out. They were very disappointed that their war, that went for so much longer, had been overlooked by the Battle of Waterloo. This is so, it is part of history, and particularly obvious with military history. The veterans of the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force that served in German New Guinea in 1914 felt that they were completely forgotten once the Gallipoli campaign erupted in 1915. And so this is just the nature. I mean, veterans of the confrontation, our confrontasi, the undeclared war we fought with Indonesia from 1962 to 66, they feel obviously that their deployments were well and truly forgotten, as do many of the Australians who served with the Royal Australian Regiment or on exchange with the British during the emergency in Malaya between 1948 and 1960. So I think it is natural that Korean War veterans, being so close to the Second World War, compare the way the Second World War is memorialised and the way their war isn't. But I think that is a natural response to veterans of small wars comparing their service to those who had served in a world war.
Absolutely. And so just to finish up, Brad, how would you like the Korean War to be remembered as part of Australia's military history, and why?
Look, I think the Korean War is a very important part of our history because it presents us with a number of firsts. It's the first time Australia goes to war in support of the United Nations. It's the first time the Australian Regular Army goes to war. It's the first time that Australia really becomes a major international player in a conflict, and we see the Australian Army, Navy and Air Force learning its trade. We deploy an aircraft carrier. The Navy deploys its fleet air arm to the war. The Royal Australian Regiment goes from largely Second World War footing to modern patrol actions against on a battlefield in which the Royal Australian Air Force begins the war with piston-engined Second World War surplus fighter aircraft, finishes the war in the jet age, and the Royal Australian Regiment distinguishes itself as part of a multinational force. So the Korean War is a fascinating schoolroom for the Australian forces. And so I think we remember the Korean War for those reasons. I think we also remember the war because it brings an awareness of Korea that is now a very serious economic relationship to Australia's sphere of understanding the world, I suppose. Prior to the war, Australians had probably, the vast majority of Australians had never heard of Korea. After the war, there was an awareness of it. So when in 1961 we began to develop a very strong economic relationship with South Korea, the Republic of Korea, Australians had heard of the place. So there were political and economic benefits to Australia's military deployments to the Korean War. And for veterans, the number of pilgrimages have been very, very important. I had a dear friend in Western Australia, a late friend now, Ray Parry, a remarkable and gallant soldier, survivor of the Second World War, serving with an independent company on Timor and later with a cavalry commando unit in New Guinea, mentioned in dispatches, barely out of his teens, and couldn't find himself at the end of the Second World War, and so volunteered for K-Force and earned the military medal at the Battle of Kapyong, fought again at Mariang San. Very, very fine soldier, but the war just finished him. He really felt that he'd pushed his luck too far, and he'd seen Seoul destroyed. The capital of South Korea was in ruins when he left. But when he went back to Korea in 2001 as part of the pilgrimage, he said seeing happy, healthy, well-educated little Korean kids come out to welcome them changed his life in a way that nothing else could have done. He came back from Korea a much happier man as a result of that pilgrimage. And I think that was a really important thing for the Australian government to do, and certainly for veterans to find some peace and to see that their suffering between 1950 and 1953 had built a better career and a much more prosperous career.
Absolutely. Brad, it's been fascinating to just sit here and talk to you about the Korean War, and I thank you for coming on True Blue History and just delving into the Korean conflict, and I thank you, and we will definitely get you back on the show in the future. So Brad Manera, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Adam. I look forward to it. See you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/True Blue History, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/True Blue History, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.